The gluteus maximus, medius, and minimus are powerful muscles surrounding the posterior and lateral sides of the hip joint. The gluteus maximus is the most superficial of the three gluteal muscles. It's the largest and strongest muscle in the human body. It has its origin on the sacrum and on kind of the back end of the ilium over here. And then it has its insertion on the back of the femur, on the gluteal tuberosity, so on the back posterior surface. And then it also attaches to the iliotibial tract, which we can't really see right here, but the IT band that we're probably all familiar with that runs along kind of the lateral side, the lateral side of the leg. The gluteus maximus extends. It's a major extensor muscle of the hip and also outwardly rotates the hip, which should be pretty obvious how it does that. It's posterior to the hip joint, so it's going to extend it. And then if we think of how it's contracting back here, that's going to outwardly rotate the hip. But then when we look at abduction and adduction, part of the gluteus maximus lies above the hip joint and part of it lies below. So the superior fibers of the gluteus maximus are going to abduct the hip joint. So they'd be like drawing the femur up. And then the lower fibers are going to adduct the hip joint and be bringing the leg back in toward the center of the body. So the upper fibers are going to abduct the hip joint, and the lower fibers will adduct the hip joint. If we go back around to the back and remove the maximus, then we can better see the gluteus medius, which is kind of right on the side of the hip, right up here. It has its origins on the gluteal fossa just below the iliac crest, and then has its insertion on the lateral superior part of the greater trochanter of the femur. And the actions of this one are a little tricky because it kind of surrounds so much of the hip joint, but the easiest thing to remember is if the whole thing is contracting, really the most obvious action is abduction of the hip joint. So if the whole muscle fires together, then basically everything cancels out except for abduction. The whole thing is a powerful abductor. But then if we look at it from the side again, we can see that it kind of splits the hip joint in half. So if the hip joint is right about here, and then so if the anterior fibers are contracting, that is going to flex the hip. It's going to flex the hip and inwardly rotate. So it's going to be pulling it around, inwardly rotating it. But if the posterior fibers are contracting, that's going to extend the hip, and it will also outwardly rotate the hip joint. So it makes sense. You just have to think about it and realize that it kind of splits the hip joint down the middle. And then if we remove the gluteus medius, then we can see the gluteus minimus right here. And the attachment points are similar to just basically underneath where the gluteus medius was. So the gluteus medius was attaching to all this area up here, and this attaches just below it, and then also attaches on the lateral surface of the greater trochanter, just a little bit anterior of where the gluteus medius was attaching. So this one kind of basically functions similarly to the anterior part of the gluteus medius. We can see from its attachment points that it is just anterior of the hip joint. Here's the hip right in here. Joint, so it's going to be anterior, so it's going to flex the hip joint. It's on the lateral side still, so it's definitely going to abduct, and then it's on the front here as well. We can see that it's going to cause inward rotation of the hip. So flexion, abduction, and inward rotation. And that's exactly the same thing as the anterior fibers of the gluteus medius. They all abducted. The anterior fibers flexed and inwardly rotated, just like the gluteus medius. So the gluteus medius is just like the anterior fibers of the gluteus minimus is just like the anterior fibers of the gluteus medius. And just like if we remember the posterior fibers of the gluteus medius are basically the same thing as the superior fibers of the gluteus maximus. So the gluteus maximus and minimus, I put the wrong thing there. That's supposed to be minimus. So the gluteus medius, the anterior fibers have the same actions as the gluteus minimus, and the posterior fibers have the same action as the upper fibers of the gluteus maximus, which makes sense. because the gluteus maximus was basically back here. The gluteus minimus is kind of up here, and the gluteus medius kind of like spanned both of them and was kind of half and half. And that's exactly how we see the actions of these muscles on the hip joint. So it all looks a little bit confusing written down, but just remember where the muscles are, and you should be able to figure out what the actions are pretty easily from there.